It surprises us every time that a creator says yes to us when we ask them to be on the show. It's one of our favorite parts is talking to creators and how they got into comics and how they developed their skills. This episode, we talked to one of the longest tenured creators. He's an artist. He's a writer. He's done a lot of work for Marvel, work for DC, work for independent stuff. He is the one and the only
Howard Chaykin. Now, Howard Chaykin has had, like Chad just said, a long and storied career and has been one of the big innovators in moving comics as an art form forward. From his early work with DC, Marvel, and then on to his independent work like the masterpiece American Flag. So this is a big deal.
This is a big deal for us. The fact that he said yes to us, and the reason why this got started is because we noticed that in a lot of our videos, in our haul videos, when we buy something, he's involved in some way.
Yeah, we pop it open and we're like, oh, Howard Chaykin.
Oh, again, and it's him again. And we were like, let's see if he would want to be on the show and just talk to us about how he got started and what he likes and what, what he's working on now. And so here's our interview with Howard Chaykin.
Okay, so we are here with Howard Chaykin. And to start off with, I want to go back a little bit, all the way to the past. Now, you grew up
The beginning.
all the way to the beginning, yeah. Now, you grew up in New York City mostly, right? You started in New Jersey.
Brooklyn, born in Jersey only because I'm illegitimate. My mother was hiding me out. And raised in Staten Island, Brooklyn, Queens, and then Manhattan.
All right, so we're on Staten Island right now.
We're actually based in Staten
Island. What town? What town?
I'm in Port Richmond right now, so.
Wow. I live in Tottenville.
So where'd you live?
Fantastic. Stapleton.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
How long were you here?
But my grandparents, this is going to be really boring, but I don't give a shit.
Not at all.
My grandparents came over on the boat in 9 and were located in the ghetto on the Lower East Side, then to Brooklyn. They relocated to Staten Island when it was still farmland in the 1920. And they lived on Targee Street first, and then and I forget the next street they lived on, but they had a huge house, raised a bunch of children. My mother went to Curtis High School.
So did I. I graduated. I'm a Curtis High School graduate.
Wow, local talent. And I was raised I spent a great deal of time in that area. In those days, Staten Island was still functionally rural, with small towns. I mean, my brother on his first move when he first moved to Southern California in the early 70s, described Los Angeles as Staten Island in the year 2100. In that it was a series of small communities which became connected by road. And I grew up for the most part playing in the park on Bay Street, the little city park, and buying toys over there. I loved it over there. I mean, I was a kid. I was a gun kid and a toy soldier kid, and all of us played together. We united. I spent weekends there constantly. I'm assuming Staten Island is now more like Long Island or Brooklyn.
Yes, it's very much like Long Island. I grew up on Long Island originally, and it's very similar to where I grew up, Nassau County, Levittown, East.
I mean, it was deteriorating in those days, and one of the things we never understood till after we got old enough to understand is that Staten Island much more belonged to New Jersey than it did to New York.
Yeah.
It's
still
provincial.
Still now.
I mean, it's provincialism. It's redness in a blue state, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And it does still have those qualities very much.
Yes.
Yeah. My grandparents were built. There's now an African Methodist tabernacle at the top of. I don't even know if it's still an AME tabernacle at the top of Bay Street when the bus turns up off Bay Street and heads toward the ferry. That my grandparents built that was a synagogue. My grandparents were part of the building of that, and I learned everything I know about being contrarian and a complete fucking asshole from hanging around outside with the old guys who were in their 20s and 30s.
Right.
Who were also Camels and Chesterfields and arguing about the relative merits of the New York Giants and the New York Yankees, and the concept of argumentative behavior derived from that experience.
Right.
So I hold Staten Island in great esteem, but I have not been there. Last time I was there was it's got to be 50 some odd years when I went out there to get paid.
Yeah, you wouldn't recognize it now. There's not a piece of empty land anywhere. There is a house built on every single.
Out by me, there's plenty of empty land.
It's just we're overcrowded, we're overpriced.
Really? Oh, It's so fucked up.
The prices of houses on Staten Island right now, I actually have my oldest daughter is getting married and she started looking. I mean, where Brian lives over in Tottenville, house is like 1.3 million.
Not my
No shit.
not my house.
And by me, which is and it sounds like you really know the island. So Port Richmond for us now, she's looking houses here to be close to us. They're like 580,000,
Oh shit.
700,000. It's Staten Island is insane right now in terms of.
I mean, I take it back. The last time I was in Staten Island was for dinner with Phil Suling.
Okay.
Phil was the guy who basically invented the direct sales market. He's responsible for modern fandom. And Phil, I've known Phil since I was in my 20s.
Right.
And Phil was a great gourmand. And he and I and his girlfriend and my second wife drove out to the island to a restaurant just above the port in Port Richmond.
Okay.
Near the theater. There used to be a movie theater up there.
Yep. Okay.
It's still there?
No.
And okay. And it was just an absolutely amazing joint. And this has to be 1980.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, I used to buy comics from Alan on Bay Street.
Okay.
Is that
He's not there anymore.
That's not there.
He's
no.
not there anymore.
I'm assuming it's an entirely different landscape.
Yeah.
It's like going to Chicago now after not being there for years.
Right.
So
We only really have
we're
one.
talking about comic books and real estate, ladies and
Yeah,
gentlemen.
we only have at one point when I was growing up, and I've been here my whole life, we had like 9 comic shops on Staten Island. We are down to one.
Where is it? Which one?
Jim Hanley's Universe.
On New York.
Yeah, I know Jim Staten, yeah.
Yeah.
Is he still on Bay Street?
No, he's on Newdorp Lane now.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So you were introduced to comics.
Is the ferry free now? Is that it?
Ferry's free. Ferry's been free for many, many years,
Yeah.
but I mean everything else is insane.
Very expensive. Yeah. So you were introduced to comics by your cousin, right?
Yes.
Your refrigerator box full of comics in Staten Island. Do you remember what your favorites were when you were younger?
No.
No.
It has to be understood that in those days, if you read comics, you read all comics. You read everything.
Right.
Funny animals, you read teenage stuff,
Sure.
super stuff, the science stuff, monster stuff, war stuff. The only stuff that turned me off was the monster stuff because I'm a big pussy. I have blood belongs inside. I hate that shit.
Sure.
But I was just absolutely enamored with them. Just the very franchise just gutted me like a fish.
Mm-hmm.
It was. I mean, I was talking on Sunday about the transformative experience of a life, and that was my first transformative experience.
Mm-hmm.
It really was. I mean, it changed everything for me. I taught myself to read from that shit.
Yeah.
And as I've said more than once. And that. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I could. You could just turn the camera on and the microphone. I'll just talk for a fucking hour.
Yeah. What I was thinking was, you said in other interviews that your origins were humble. Let's say that you were disadvantaged as a kid, and then comics were something that you latched onto. And I've been noticing that the more creators we talk to, and the more creators we research, this seems to be a common theme for some reason. A lot of creators start out with very difficult childhoods, socioeconomically anyway. And some reason comics are the thing that grabs them. I've read this about Alan Moore. I've read this about Frank Miller.
Michael Avon said the same
Michael
thing.
Avon Oming, your origin. And I'm wondering, is there something to that? Is there something about this sort of mix of disadvantaged childhood and the fantasy escape of comics that just sort of grabs people and holds on to them and drags them into this industry in some way?
I think to a certain extent, it's the cheapness of the material. It used to be cheap. It isn't anymore.
No.
The cheapness of the material in its time and the accessibility of the material in its time and its crudeness. I mean, the comic book fan, even today, remains aspirational.
Yeah.
The material that's most popular, it's most successful. It's stuff that either you feel you could do,
Right.
or directly accesses how you feel about life as you're living it. The adolescent power fantasies of superhero comic books goes directly to the source of guys who feel powerless and lost.
Sure.
And as I've said more than once, my mother died having no idea what I do for a living. No clue at all. and never understood that my entire life was saved by this shit.
Yeah.
I mean that with all my heart. I mean, I became who I am because of two things: comic books and drugs. And I'm not being in any way facetious. I'm quite serious.
Yeah.
The two things were enormously instrumental, and I think that, you know, in talking to the older guys, I mean, one of the things that separates me from a lot of my contemporaries, and certainly those younger than me, is that I had long-standing relationships with old men, the guys who did the stuff that I read when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And the unifying factor of those people was that in many cases, these kids, these 15-year-old kids, were the breadwinners of their family because their fathers couldn't get work. I mean, comic books drew its talent pool from 99% Jews, a couple of Italians, and a couple of Polish guys,
Right.
and maybe a couple of Puerto Ricans, and the rest of them were all these little old Jews, young 14-year-old Jews on the make,
Yep.
who thought this was a temporary waste stop before they wanted to something else.
Sure.
And the unifying factor of that was poverty. The only guy who didn't come from poverty, those old guys, was Kubert. Kubert came from a much more middle class background.
Okay.
Carmine, Gill, Frank, Jacoya, they were all poor kids.
Eagle and
you know,
Schuster. Yep.
you know, and well, Schuster was, so he doesn't really count.
What? I'm sorry.
Canadians, who doesn't really count. You know?
Oh.
But you know, a lot of the ghettoized kids, you know, like that talent pool. You know, Woody came from Minnesota. Williamson came from Argentina. But the core group, the guys who built the kids who were drawing comic books in the 1940s when able-bodied men were dying overseas, were all of this ilk.
Yeah.
And you know, and they all came out of the same interest level. They were all introduced. They were pulp readers, then comic strip readers. You know, all of them. They were all Brooklyn, Manhattan, you know, and a couple of Jersey, a couple of Bronx. You know, they all went to the same high school. They all knew each other since they were children. Many of them hated each other from the time they were children.
Yeah.
You know, my generation, there's a mini generation between those old guys and mine. The guys who were born in 38 to 40, like Roy and Neil, Gray, Tom Palmer, Steve Skates. But that's a mini generation, Sorenko. My generation was all born between 46 and 50.
Right.
I'm the youngest member of my cadre. And it mattered a lot more in your 20s than it does in your 70s, of course.
Yeah.
But, you know, Simonson comes from a very middle-class background. You know, his parents are, his dad was an academic. Yeah. But, you know, I grew up on welfare. Kaluta was an army kid. You know, Weiss's dad was a crafts dealer in Vegas. You know, so that generation. Wrightson's dad was Ralph Cramden. Wrightson always described his dad as the living incarnation of Ralph Cramden. He was a Baltimore bus driver. Yeah. You know, it's a blue collar, lower middle class. You know, the audience, the talent pool is derived from the audience.
Right. Yeah. I'm a big fan of Alan Moore, and I read a lot of what he writes and stuff like that. And he used to talk about it being the most democratic of entertainments, because if you were a kid, you had a few coins in your pocket, you could go put them on a counter and get something that somebody put work into, that made a work of art, you know? And that was one of the things that maybe connected these people with this idea. There's something more than this, you know?
Well, I mean, you know, the cliche of rolling up a comic book in your back pocket on the way to get your hair cut.
Yeah.
You know, it's an endemic truth.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm married to a woman who's never read a comic book in her life, has no idea what I do for a living. You know, and it's a very healthy relationship. And she often wonders why I don't write a novel or do something else. Sure. I said, because I think of drama in terms of comic book pages.
Sure.
I see narrative in those terms. And, you know, I participated in teaching a course at various conventions across the country with Mark Wade. And one of the things I talk about there is the idea of images endowed with narrative value, which is a profoundly subjective idea, obviously. But I learned from comic books, the best comic books, that there are images that have that endowed value. And, you know, as you if you stay with the stuff, and I'm greatest hit singing right now, but I've said this more than once, that the comics has as much to do with the Jesuit treat as it does with any other kind of fandom. There's an inoculation to it. There's an induction into this sort of secret language. I remember, like I say, from the age of 4, comic book guy, and as I got older and moved into, I was totally asocial. Had no capacity for relationships with people. I was shut down, introverted, and unavailable. And comics and television and food were my recourse. And then I discovered drugs, which opened me up completely, and I became this. I'm quite serious. I mean, becoming an alcoholic and becoming a drug addict really opened me up to the possibilities of availability, and I transformed myself. But the comic book stuff stayed. Yeah, that's the guys who were reading comic books when they discovered, sex and drugs. They moved on, but I'm like, I stayed. So, because I recognized the fact that this was an avocation that could become a vocation. Right. Now, I had no real talent that I could identify. I had hunger and blind rage, which is frankly often enough. Yeah. I will tell you right now, it really is, because if you can be taught, if you can learn, you can do this. But it has to be taught and learned. There are naturally gifted and skilled and talented guys who burn out really hard because it's not sustaining. Yeah. Maintenance is provided by an evolving skill set, by continually relearning the craft, by turning your back on your own past without forgetting it and moving into another realm, right? And without resting on one's own previous experiences. And comic books is based on a fan base that wants you to rest on your previous experiences, because they identify you with the work that they most loved when they found it in the first place. Right. Like you yelled at that bullshit War of the Worlds bullshit, that nonsense.
I'll actually show it.
Don't go there. Don't anger me.
I have to say, even though you don't like it, I kind of enjoyed that series.
Because you were 11. You were 11. That great.
What I'm saying, I didn't.
James Ray goes to his dentist. Okay, the director. Yeah. And his dentist, he's a filmmaker. So his dentist says, "So have you seen the Avengers movie?" And great, when he takes the shit out of his nose, what am I, 11? And that's a perfectly reasonable answer. The golden age of comics is 12, because it's what you're inducted in at that age. I can still look with love on work that I loved when I was a child. I also can see it in all of its misbegotten flaws. Sure. Both the work I've done and the work of others that I've admired. Right. It's my relationship with the audience is checkered at best. Okay. Because and it's spelled with a Q, because I'm thinking Canadian now. I love the form of comics. I'm not particularly interested in what has become the content. Right. The language of the material. I believe that the language of the material does not get the respect it deserves. I think people are too obsessed with the content, and I think that there are lessons to be learned from narrative structure that would serve the material better. But the audience is mostly interested in the sensation of the content as opposed to the experience of the form.
And nostalgia. Yeah.
Yeah. And let's not forget, nostalgia is good nostalgia. Yeah.
Yes. It's interesting that you're saying that, because you were sort of part of a group of people in the 80s that sort of pushed comics forward more toward a more sophisticated kind of way of looking at things, with things like American Flag. It was sort of like you and Alan Moore, like I already talked about, and Frank Miller, and trying to think of some other people. Obviously a little bit later you have Spiegelman and other people who kind of pushed.
Spiegelman loathes and despises everything we do. He holds mainstream comics in complete contempt.
Right. Yeah.
And it's contempt that is mostly based on no real investigation. One of the reasons why I'm more of a marginal and cult figure in the context of the history of this history of comics we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, I didn't do work in the service of the material that was identifiably trope based. That that Alan and Frank, along with Dave, we can't dismiss Dave, were doing work that was identifiable in its tropes. It was the comics has a great deal in common with kabuki and porn, in that there's a series of trope based images that, you put a mask on a guy, you put a cape on a guy, you're whether you're doing a satirical take on it, whether you're doing a take on the ridiculousness of it, you're still working in the context of those tropes.
Right.
And I did not do that. And Flag doesn't look and read or feel like a deconstructed superhero comic book, which is what those books were. Mm-hmm. I mean, Dark Knight in retrospect, and Alan Moore, Watchmen is a fascinating exercise in someone who doesn't pay strong enough attention to where he's going. Mm-hmm. The trip is really fun. Yeah. But the conclusion of the material feels like it just sort of, fell off a bus. Yeah, he does that a lot in his work. Yeah, well, because he doesn't structure. Elmore Leonard is a favorite crime writer of mine, but particularly in the later novels, Leonard seemed to just write till he ran out of paper. Right. Like Up in Honey's Room and Pagan Babies don't really have a Djibouti. They don't really have a franchisable structure to them in the way that Stephen Hunter, for example, who's a great thriller writer, at least in the first 10 years of his career, really understood the concept of rewriting. There's a level of exposition buried in those first 100 pages of those books that pay off beautifully. They're very roundly structured, and I like structure because, like I say, I need an armature to work against. Sure. And I think one of the reasons for the huge success of those books, particularly the Dark Knight stuff, is that it flattered and confirmed the audience's assumptions and presumptions and expectations of its own tastes, and that it said that just because that everybody else thinks this is junk, it's really good. Yeah, and here's how it's really good. Mm-hmm. And most of the really goodness came out of the posturing of suicide poetry. Like striking the difficulty of the post. And comic books is a frivolous medium that is difficult to do well. Mm-hmm. But it's not like rocket science. It's not like digging a ditch. You get up in the morning, you do your fucking job, and you do it. You just you don't over dramatize it and make it like it's the pain I go through to create this material. Stop that. Be grateful that you've got a skill set that's generating cash. I'm the luckiest boy on earth, man. I really am. And I had to go elsewhere to be able to afford to be this old because I never had a commercial footprint in comic books. Yeah. My work is too weird for the mainstream, too mainstream for the weird. Mm-hmm. And I don't have a franchisable footprint that has generated enough cash for me to live this life. I'm 73. I'm 73 and a half. Mm-hmm. That's where I'm at. And I had to go elsewhere and spend 15 years working in television to be able to afford to do comic books. And that's what I did. You worked on Viper and I worked on unwatchable shit forever. And you know what? I did the best I could with the work that I did. Yeah. I had no expectations of it other than generating real estate and a pension. Right. I had. Right. I having grown up on welfare. Yeah. I recognized that there was a potential of my being a drag on the system, and I didn't want to take it. I didn't expect the system to be as charitable to me as some people do. No, yeah. And I made conscious decisions to adjust my life in the name of saving my own life, assuming that I didn't think I'd make it past 50. So this is a shock to me. Mm-hmm. I'm having lunch today with a pal of mine who I've known for 30 years, a TV colleague, who is a couple years older than me and far fitter than everything. Just like. No, I'm not that doing. No, I don't care anymore. I'm old. I don't give a shit. Whatever. But I'm a very lucky guy. I take nothing for granted. Mm-hmm. It's true. You mentioned Elmore Leonard before, and I thought of his westerns, which I like. I like his westerns. I think they're really they're tightly written and they're well done. I especially like 3:10 to Yuma. I never saw the movie, but I like the story. The first version is really good.
Yeah.
The Van Halen Ford version. The other one is just bullshit.
Yeah, I never saw either of them, but the story is great. And then I thought you did a Western as one of your first professional works, Shattuck, right?
Yeah, but that was terrible.
It was it? Yeah.
I sucked. I mean, the thing is, if you work for Wallace Wood, one of the things you learn is that Woody can take whatever you've given him and make it look good.
Mm-hmm.
Because his inks were so overpowering that anybody who worked for Woody. I mean, all the participants are dead now, so we can tell the story. I went to work for Woody, and he had a guy working for him who was not an artist, who could not draw worth a shit. Woody would hand him the oblong tabloid of Sally Forth and Cannon, which are the two strips that he was doing for the Overseas Weekly. They were basically, Sally Forth was a TNA strip. Cannon was a James Bond parody with more TNA, and just a lot of TNA.
And this was for enlisted men, right?
Pardon me? Yeah, they were sold. They were sold in a newspaper called the Overseas Weekly for PXs, and this guy would then go through the folder, and Woody would indicate they'd be panel boarded and ballooned, and he would go through the reference file and autograph using the overhead projector tracing machine to trace photographs, other people's artwork, and create this blue lined page of tracings. Woody would take that, and without a pencil in hand, would take a brush and pen and make it Woody.
Right.
So there'd be nude photos, and there'd be Alex Raymond swipes, and just stuff, and it would all coalesce in this very specific generalities of Wallace Wood's ink line. And it was enviable. I mean, that Woody is, Woody and Kirby are identified as the two bitter men in comics.
Yeah.
And I think it's significant that both their bitterness seem to be based on a willful suspension of what was obviously in front of them, that they were going to get fucked by the business that attracted them.
Yeah.
And there's an innate assumption or presumption on both their parts that it'll be different from me.
Right.
And it wasn't going to be different.
No. That's another theme we find with creators, is that a few years in the industry, they realize like, oh man, this isn't good.
Yeah.
And that eventually they either stick with it and just decide like it's a job, or they leave and don't come back.
And where are they going to go? I mean, the problem remains that, comic book writers are transient. They're transitional. They can go elsewhere. They use comic books as a means to hone their craft. Comic book artists, because they're stuck in a trope-based form, really have nowhere else to go.
Yeah.
The advertising market no longer exists. I mean, I could not have survived in the 1970s without the application of my skill set to storyboards and mechanicals and comps.
Right.
I mean, I was making $150 a day, a couple of days a week for years on end.
Yeah.
That was the sustenance, doing teeny frames for advertising agencies. That market no longer exists.
Right.
I mean, when you see an illustration that's done in a comic book style, it's never done by a comic book artist. It's done by an illustrator, who is imitating the worst aspects of comic book art.
Well, I think a lot of them try to do what you did. A lot of them are trying to get into Hollywood. So their other avenue
TV
is
movies,
to get into TV and movies. And we've spoke to a couple of creators who have, dipped their toe in Hollywood, so to speak, and are making the majority of their money from that.
Even if the stuff doesn't get made.
Right. The money now is flat. There's no money in it anymore because of the structural model of streaming and cable.
Yeah.
When I came in, I worked on one network show, and then the rest of them were all syndication. But in syndication in those days, you got paid about $5,000 less per script than network, but you also got 3 reruns as opposed to 1. And then you made it. I mean, syndication was making like a bandit. Of course, I was also making a weekly salary as well on top of screenplay writing.
Right.
Teleplays. I mean, I wrote 16 or 17 hours of television, but I also generated a weekly paycheck.
Yeah.
My first job, they got me cheap. Like two network shows. I worked on The Flash, then I worked on Viper when it was on NBC, and went back to when it was on UPN. But none of this shit is anything I'd ever choose to watch.
Right.
I mean, quite seriously. And there's nothing about that stuff that interested me at all.
Right.
All my samples were 10 o'clock samples. I blew one potential gig out of greed and hubris. And I look back on that as a real turning point. It was a mistake on my part that I will always pay for. I had a shot at working on Law and Order.
Law and Order.
The money was right, but the title was wrong. There wasn't an advance on my title. And I assumed that they're making me this offer, someone else is going to come along with me. It never happened. So, it is what it is. I'm okay. With whatever disdain and contempt I had for the material, I never did anything but the best work I could. Because I'm too much of an imposter to take a chance at not doing the best I can do. I'm always afraid of being identified as like the phony behind the curtain. And, I mean, people tend to mistake my dismissal of my earlier work as self-deprecatory and self-loathing, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. It's a demonstration of enormous pride that I've come far from that shit, that I've moved on and developed a skill set that is admirable and worthy of emulation. Because there are those guys who just hit a mark when they were in their 20s, were amazing, and never got any better or any different, never involved in any way. I have a list of those guys, those names, and I laugh at them at night.
So
I sucked in my 20s. Understand? I really blew.
now, what were you working on in your 20s? Was that when you were working on the Star Wars books? Or?
Star Wars. I mean, the idiocy of the War of the Worlds thing was really stupid on my part. It was really a moron move. I turned around and saved. I mean, it's a perfect illustration. No good deed goes unpunished. I turned around and finished the job that Neil Adams had started, and I could not look at anything but shit by comparison. And the work was terrible. It was really awful. But also I had no idea what I was doing. And what I was talking about earlier about that language, understanding the language of the journal, I didn't understand. I didn't know there was a language. It was just, it was like Robert Crumb's crack about it's just lines on paper. Okay.
Yeah.
But, I didn't really have an understanding of narrative structure. The reason I got work to a profound extent was that writers are smart enough to identify that I was someone who made their lives easier. And I mean, for example, in the Star Wars stuff, I broke that screenplay down into 6 issues of a comic book.
Yeah.
Roy never saw anything until he got my pencils on the first issue. So, I mean, I made life very easy for him, and I profited in no way from it.
Right.
Same is true of a lot of the work I did at DC. With Denny, with Gerber at Marvel, and Denny at DC, and then Roy at Marvel. And it wasn't until I came to understand that I was a better writer than most of the people with whom I was working, that many of the guys who worked as writers in comics in my generation were failed artists. That didn't seem to me a valid resume to justify their existence. And I taught myself to write.
Yeah.
I've said more than once that I stand on the shoulders of 5 guys, Gil Kane, Wallace Wood, Gray Morrow, Neil Adams, and Joe Orlando. And the great unifying factor of those things, none of those guys could write worth a shit. They were just terrible writers. And a lot of it is that they didn't have, there was a disconnect between what they were doing visually to what they were doing textually. And I learned early on, certainly, before I did flag stuff, to find the synergy that existed between text and image. And that's where the value of my work lives. I'm not the best writer in the world, I'm not the best artist in the world, but together, those two franchises in unison are what make the work valuable. And the problem with that, of course, is that you go to comic book conventions and I'd like a drawing of Black Bolt, please. Then it's okay, great, that's for you.
Yeah. How do you like doing conventions? What's your take on it?
I love doing shows. I really do. Mainly because it's the days are spent engaging with fans, right, coming away with either, pleasant narrative or confrontational bullshit, which I'm perfectly comfortable with in either way. Yeah. And then evenings are, a lot of my colleagues, they take all these commissions, they go back to the hotel room, they work through the night drawing, fuck that shit. Me, when the bell rings at the end of the day, it's dinner with colleagues. Talking shop and talking shit. I'm off next week to Finland for a convention.
Really?
And
Oh, that's nice.
I'm looking forward to seeing some guys I haven't seen in a long time over there. You know? When I get back, I'm going to Oklahoma City. I'm doing 3 Galaxy shows this year. I love those guys, Mike and Peter. And the Galaxy shows are brilliantly structured franchises, and I'm looking forward to them enormously. I don't do San Diego, and I don't do New York. I don't do C2E2 because I'm not the kind of guest those people want.
Right.
The last time I did San Diego, I was so utterly dismissive and just I hated the way I was treated. I was treated like a has-been, and fuck you. You know, I'm still working.
Yeah.
Not happy. And when they gave me that fucking Eisner Award, 10 years too late, I might add, they ran a photograph of me in my 40s, my late 30s, early 40s, so that they could find a way to make it look like you're doing it posthumously. So please go fuck yourselves. You know?
Yeah.
My Eisner Award is in the garage behind my dog food.
So you mentioned colleagues too, and there was a point where you lived with Al Milgrom, Walt Simonson, Bernie Wright.
I lived in the same building.
Oh, the same building. I'm sorry.
I've never roommated.
Right.
I'm not a roommate. I'm not a roommate guy. I like to walk around my own.
Okay.
Are those the colleagues that you still like talk to and spend time with?
I talked to Walter. Walter's in the process of moving right now, so he's unavailable. He's like,
Yeah.
you know. But I mean, I've been trying to get Kalu to get out of the fucking house now for since the 90s. You know,
Yeah.
I was in New York just before the lockdown, the February of 20, having no idea that was coming. I already had theater tickets ready for May and shit. It was like, I go see it. You know? And I got a call from my pal Mike Stratford, the guy that I'm doing this crowdfunder with on Fargo. And Mike was in town that week, rather. He's like, I got Kalu to join us. I said, no, please forget about it. So I went uptown, went to Sarah Beth's, and Kalu showed up. It was the first time I'd seen Mike in a long time. And there's this great photograph of the two of us standing in front of Sarah Beth's, freezing our asses off. And I've been trying to get him to come out. But Facebook is a great communicator. But I have lunch at least once a month with a bunch of guys who are somewhat younger than me. With Sienkiewicz, Mark Chiarello, Dave Johnson, occasionally Panosian, occasionally Scott Koblish. And we just brought a guy who made the right choice and decided not to become a comic book guy. Who's a mainstream illustrator named Scott Anderson. Scott's a great guy. He lives up in Santa Barbara. I live in Ventura, which is about an hour and a half, 2 hours north of Los Angeles. Which is it's like when I first saw it 22 years ago now. It reminded me very much of what Canarsie was like in the early 1950s. And that first wave of GI Bill building. Now it's sort of like not quite gentrified, but it's still the redneck Riviera West. And so I meet those guys. And again, it's shit and shop talk.
Right.
But there are a lot of guys in my generation around. I mean, I don't have a lot in common with us. Walter's the only one I'm in regular touch with.
It's funny. Our first interview ever was Al Milgrom.
Yeah.
Again?
Our first interview we ever did for this show was Al Milgrom.
Al Milgrom. Yeah.
Okay.
We spoke to Al at a convention. Yeah. And he had some very, very interesting things to say about that time.
He's cranky.
Simonson's.
He's cranky.
Yeah.
I live in a one-bedroom apartment. Wrightson lived just below me, and Milgrom and Simonson lived together. Megan had moved out. Milgrom had been living with Elliot, and Walter and Alan lived in the same place. But Walter and I had lived across the street from each other in Brooklyn for the longest time as well, over on Argyle Road. Wrightson's moving from Suffern to parts north, which I think is
He likes the cold, huh?
In our interview with Al Milgrom, he took credit for setting up the Simonsons.
Yeah.
I think that's probably true.
Yeah.
No, I think it is true. Back in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s, we used to do a supper club with Alan and Judy, Walter and Weezy, Archie and Ann, and me and my then wife. And it was a great way to be social. We all ate and drank a lot together when we were all in New York. It was a very, very collegial, very convivial crew. My days I started my days earlier than anybody at Upstart. I like getting there really early in the morning. Walter would roll in around 11, bullshit till 2, and then work. And by the time he started working, my day was winding down.
Yeah.
But I was also the only one that could walk there. I walked across town to get there.
Now, Upstart was
I lived on the corner of 25th and 2nd, and the studio was on 29th between 7th and 8th. There was no reasonable way to get there other than on foot.
right. Now, just for our viewers who don't know Upstart, but Upstart was a studio you had with Walt Simonson, Val Myrick, and Jim Starlin, right?
And then later, Frank Miller, and then Jim Sherman. Sherman, I think, I understand, lives in the space right now. I saw Jim very briefly in passing last Sunday in New York City. I did a one-day event, Comic Expo at the Hilton, with a bunch of talent. And with Lee was there, Scott Hanna, Steranko was down the way, Billy Tucci was to my left, but to my right politically, and so just seeing these guys. So Klaus briefly. I'm looking forward to Baltimore as the collegial event. Baltimore and Terrificon, the show. Getting the show, the Terrificon and the Baltimore show are both major collegial events. I do the Terrificon every other year. I do Baltimore every year. I go to
Terrificon every year, except this year.
It's a great show.
It's a great show. It's a great show.
And again, it's the only drag is that you have to make reservations at restaurants weeks in advance just to make sure everything is taken care of. Yeah. And the food is really mediocre. It's a really mediocre.
Inside of Mohegan Sun, everything.
You realize the best restaurant in the house is Hash House on Go-Go. You know you're in serious shit.
Yeah,
and it is. It really is.
I've been trying to convince Brian to go to Baltimore. He's never been to Baltimore, and I've gone a number of times.
Baltimore's a great show.
Great show.
The problem with Baltimore, here we're going to go verge into more real estate. Baltimore is a town that, like San Francisco, has been hit very hard. Yeah. Was hit very hard by the lockdown and the pandemic and the financial downturn. I have historically hosted a dinner with Dean Haspiel the night before the show for years. And we used to do it at the Inner Harbor, but the Inner Harbor now shuts down at 8. Yeah. A non-franchise steakhouse that was a regular spot for us is closed. So, it's Morton's and La Scala, but Baltimore is a dynamite show. It really is. And if you're on the island, grab a train. It's an easy train ride down. It's like, the Acela takes you right there. There's no reason to drive through that car because driving down there.
No, it's the worst.
It's a deeply unrewarding experience. Yeah. Get the fuck out of here with that.
It's pretty bad.
Oh, it's awful. But I was in DC a week ago. I did a show for J.D. Sutphin, the Big Lick Nova, and then took a train up to New York for the Sunday thing. And I found it fascinating that neither DC nor New York seem to have really suffered any profound effects from the post-lockdown. Whereas San Francisco is a disaster.
You see little things in New York, just little things that you notice are weird about things that still to this day, you go to a store to get eggs, and for some reason, the store has no eggs at all. And we didn't see that before the lot. Like things like that, just little sort of surreal touches that you're like,
okay.
And the smaller stores took a beating and they're closing. So because you had nobody in the city for so long, you had nobody buying stuff.
Especially stores that were already struggling, like bookstores.
What?
You commuted to the city to work?
No, we luckily teach on Staten Island, but I worked in the city for many, many years and still have friends that work for the industry that I worked in before being a teacher. And it's like you said with the restaurants, it's hard sometimes. The restaurants you went to for years and years and years, they're gone now.
Gone, yeah.
And now, what level do you teach?
Right now I'm teaching 5th grade. I teach special ed, and Brian teaches middle school ELA. So he teaches 7th and 8th grade.
Middle school, what is it?
English.
Yeah, English language
arts.
Yeah.
English language arts.
Yeah.
Creative writing or reading?
It's creative writing, it's reading, it's all of it. All rolled into one.
Yeah, okay. That's what you teach.
I come out of the pre-middle school. I come out of junior high, yeah, right. It was like, you went to high school in 10th grade, and the only people who were there before you of your generation were guys who got kicked out of Catholic school or yeshiva. It was that. Yeah. What are you doing here? They didn't want me. Jesus didn't want me, and Moses didn't either.
Actually, we see a huge impact from the lockdown now in school with the way
that I can dig.
Students are very, very different than they were 4 years ago.
Yeah, and again, you want to talk about sci-fi, that's the only place we can go for metaphors for some of the things we're seeing.
Yeah.
The sort of closed off lack of social skills, the no connection to community.
Yeah, there's no energy, and the kids they have no energy for learning or anything.
very
They
strange.
don't really like anything. They don't.
Well, I have four grandchildren. The girls are mature; they're adults now. One of them's already a college graduate. The other one's close to graduating. And the two boys are 14 going to be 15 in August, and 12 going to be 13 in June. And the 12-year-old is a grind. He's really busting ass. I mean, he's sort of like a little Superman. He's a physical athlete. He's a serious ball player, and he's a really good student. Whereas the 15-year-old is going to be 15, is a serious theater kid.
Yeah,
and he's committed, and it's like it's been a lifesaver for him.
That's great.
His my son-in-law died 2 years ago. It'll be 3 years in January.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And I've been designated the dad, not the dad, but the man in his life, and a theater guy as well. So I've seen him work, and I'm taking him to New York in August. His mom took him to New York last August to see Sweeney Todd. Good mom.
Oh yeah.
And I'm taking him. My wife and I are taking him to New York this August to see Cabaret, Chicago, and Little Shop of Horrors.
Nice.
And what's fascinating is he's, the first show I took him to was Moulin Rouge a couple of years ago, and he was like, "This is really dirty," that kind. I said, "No, it's not. It's sexy." He said, "Sexy is dirty." He says, "So what do you want to see in New York? Cabaret and Chicago. Those are really dirty.
Those are dirty.
This is some dirty shit." And I got a text from him yesterday. He says, "Can we squeeze in Book of Mormon?" And I said, "I can't. We're booked for we got 3 shows in 2 days. And Book of Mormon is fucking filthy. Your mother will have my fucking head." Disgusting. I mean, I loved it. I mean,
it's fantastic.
I avoided seeing Book of Mormon for years because I'm not a fan of South Park. I find that stuff obvious and puerile. And I got dragged to see Book of Mormon by a pal of mine, who I travel with to New York at least once a year. And he's like, I just loved it. It was the very rare example of a show where the second act was better than the first. It's just a great show. So I'm going to be in New York in June with that guy and our travel agent and another pal of ours, the 4 of us. It's the Hebrew, Highlander, homophobe, and the homosexual. No bullshit. We travel together regularly. It's like, he's not really, he is gay. He's gay. What? It's that kind of cruise. So we're going to see Water for Elephants, The Outsiders, Great Gatsby, and Cabaret.
Wow. That's quite a lineup.
4 shows, 3 days.
Yeah. Oh, wow. 4 shows. Wow. Like my wife drives me once a year. She makes me go to 1 show a year.
Not a fan.
I'm not a fan. My youngest is 22. She's graduating in less than a month. She actually is a theater kid too. She's been studying theater. That's what she wants to do. So they go when my family goes like 6 or 7 times a year. They drag me once a year. The last one she dragged me to was Barry Manilow's wrote that. Harmony. It's fantastic. I hate Broadway.
I hate Barry Manilow, but that show. The thing about that show that pissed me off was that it was so guyish.
But it was so amazing to the story that I would say 99% of people have no idea.
Right. Well, I might add, I have a lot of their records.
Oh, you really? Okay. So you know them.
It's just they were basically. They were a bunch of mostly Jewish, a couple of German guys who were doing 4-part harmony.
Yeah, it was.
They were German language. I mean, their version of Happy Days Are Here Again.
Right.
Wolken und Sonnenschein. I thought the show was a little bit too vanilla for its own good.
Okay. It was the first show I've ever been to where people around me were hysterical crying.
Oh, that was Days of Wine and Roses. I just like bawling, just teary. A great show.
That's a great story.
Yeah,
it's also a phenomenon. It's a very cast. I'm the most digressive motherfucker you've ever. I can't help it. I can't help it. They should have interest. So I'm supposed to be in London next week after Finland. I may or may not go as far as that, but I'm seeing Guys and Dolls again if I go for the second time over there, and it's my favorite show. The influence that Guys and Dolls, that Frank Lesser's work, that Damon Runyon's work had on me as a writer and as an illustrator cannot be overstated. Lesser was and again, Stephen Sondheim validated my feelings about this. For my money, the single greatest vernacular American songwriter who ever lived. He managed to make songs that sounded like character speech, and it's just the work just continues to destroy me. Mm-hmm. The London production, unfortunately, was beautiful American accents by English actors, but all very generic. There's no New Yorkness to them all.
Right. Yeah.
And it's like Guys and Dolls is a New York. It's a pastrami show. It really is.
Yeah.
It's just so.
It's what I'm
but
getting.
Again, digress.
So what
Times Squared is very much what happens if Philip K. Dick, Frank Lesser, and Damon Runyon go to Stephen Sondheim's house.
So you're saying you said Times Squared.
What's that?
You said Times Squared, right?
Yes.
Your comic. And you I think in past interviews you've said that was one of your favorite of your works because it had a personal connection to you.
Oh, absolutely. It's a very much a reflection of a Fantasia based version of what the world looked like to me when I was a little,
right.
Showed the world of theater, movies, Broadway, Greenwich Village, all that stuff.
Yeah.
It's just a big part of my life.
And that was after you did The Shadow, right?
No, it preceded it.
It preceded The Shadow. Okay.
Yes.
Shadow was what, 86?
85, right? 87. Shadow was I'm sorry, that's right. It was actually did The Shadow between the first and second.
Okay.
The Shadow and I committed to do The Shadow in September of 85. Mm-hmm. Because in July of 85, because Dick Giordano offered it to me then, and I was moving to California in October of 85. I needed something to get started with, and that was going to be my seed work. Mm-hmm. And my belongings arrived a week late, and I'm panicking. So as they're moving my shit in, I'm assembling my drawing table. By the time they'd finished unloading all my belongings, I had done the rough pencil for what became the cover of the first issue of The Shadow. Mm-hmm. And so that was a magical time. I had a great little tiny studio in the back of my house. My first year in California, it poured rain for weeks on end, and I said, "This is okay." And then the drought starts. Everything goes to hell.
Yeah.
I've been here more than half my life, but I remain a New Yorker on permanent leave.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I live in a.
You can't leave it.
You can't leave it.
And
no, it's just.
It sounds like, and you said before, you're 73. You're going to be 74, correct? That you
3.5.
Live a very eventful life for a 73-year-old.
I consider myself very lucky and deeply blessed. I mean, I really am. I dodged a bullet, And again, I mean, I could wake up dead any day now,
right?
But or drop dead where I'm standing. But meanwhile, I'm going out screaming.
I mean, you're going to Finland and England and New York. Next couple of days, you think it could be all.
I was in Italy and London in November. That's when I saw this Guys and Dolls production. Anyway. The year before, I mean, back in the first decade of this century, I was in Germany, England, and Spain every year, and the Germans have let up, and I miss them terribly because despite the guilt of all the 6 million murdered, I like Germany. Mm-hmm. I like the people there. I have very fond relationships with a lot of the publishers over there that are people, colleagues, mm-hmm. And I like the culture, and I love the food.
And that's all convention based? You're going for convention?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm also a tourist. I mean,
okay.
I mean, for example, I did Lucca in November. I had not been to Lucca at the convention in 40 years, but I've been there as a tourist a number of times. Right. And I had no idea how the convention itself had metastasized into an American style event. The entire town is taken over. The locals have the same relationship with the convention as San Diegans have with the convention, which is a love-hate relationship. We love the money that brings it, but it disturbs life. I mean, the American cosplay just all over the place. It was not a pleasant event. I had great times with in nowadays you're brought over by your publisher. So my publisher was my host. Mm-hmm. So they worked me every day. And when I first went to the show, publishers would have booths in pavilions. Now publishers have pavilions.
Right.
And I had a great time. My wife was not well, so she missed a lot of the fun stuff. And it was intermittent torrential rain. But I'm hoping when I do the Finland show that I'll make some contacts with some conventions over there, because I really like my favorite country in the world is Spain. Spain is an absolutely breathtakingly wonderful place. And I love Madrid, and I love the north of Spain in Asturias, the three cities of Asturias. Spain, in terms of food, is what Americans think Italy is. Mm-hmm. Spanish cooking is mind-fuckingly good. It's just astonishing. And when I was working in television, I did a lot more travel and for fun than I do now. But I'll bolter. I mean, for example, I did this thing at DC in Washington DC, and did the New York thing in the middle of the week. I paid my own hotel tickets. I went to the theater in London, in DC, and went to the theater in New York City, and hung around. My wife and I had a great week in New York City and DC. So I'll latch on an additional event if I'm traveling somewhere. I mean, for example, in June when I'm traveling with the other three H's. The week will start in Charlotte. I'm doing that show. And the following weekend, I'm doing the Garden State show, which, by the way, is a terrific little show.
We'll be there. We'll be there.
Mars
I go to that every year.
It's a great little show. Yeah. I told Dave I would do it, but only if they put the Republicans in the cold room again. Come on, you got to make standards somehow. Listen, I got to get my shit together to be moving on. We got to wrap this up in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, we'll come over and say hello to you at that show because we'll be there. We go to Jersey show every year.
Are you taller than I look? Than you look?
And I'm actually quite short.
I'm really short.
No, and I won't have this beard then because this
you will.
No. You got to go Old Testament, you know.
Yeah.
No,
we need a wizard, Gandalf kind of thing going.
Brand.
I have one question for you.
Ask away.
I know Brian had a lot of questions. I had one question for you, and you.
I'm sorry we digress so much.
No, that's fine. We actually enjoy this. I have one question. You may be mad about this question. I don't know. I'm very interested in this,
the history
of this, and how did you get in your involvement in this? Because it goes so quickly. So, what was that?
Question.
The question is, how did you get involved with that? And what was the experience like being with? So, I mean, it started and ended so quickly.
Well, here, I mean, I was approached by the people at the company.
Right.
The editors, about doing a pulp character. That was their description. They had the name the Scorpion.
Right.
And I think they were expecting was something like the Shadow or the Spider or the Green Hornet, something like that. And rather, I wanted to do something that was nuttier, you know. And I brought that in fully formed. They were very happy. I still think it's the best thing they ever published. But I was very late with the second one. I couldn't get it finished. And I got a lot of help on the second one. Ed Davis helped out. Wrightson helped out. Kaluta helped out.
Mm-hmm.
And we got into a wrangle. And they fired my ass.
Okay.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
And I was, I went across the street. And they were on 57th Street. Marvel was on Madison and 58th. Mm-hmm. I walked 2.5 blocks to Marvel. I said, hey, how would you like to do the Scorpion with a different name at Marvel? And things were so casual back then. They said, sure.
Yeah.
That's how Dominic Fortune was born.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But I mean, it was a much more freewheeling and loose experience. And of course, in retrospect, what a schmuck I was to create books for other people to own. But that was the nature of the business. And that was it. I mean, I had there's still anecdotal comedy that comes out of the Atlas Company.
Mm.
Just some really funny shit that I can't talk about because people aren't dead yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I learned from Sondheim a long time ago, always speak ill of the dead because they can't defend themselves. But I do wait for them to be dead,
Okay.
Well,
does that in any way answer your question?
Yes, it does help. Yes, it does.
Brian, what do you got?
The last thing I wanted to ask, well, no, this is the second to last thing. Then I'm going to let you go.
Okay.
You did a graphic novel adaptation of The Stars, My Destination. This is just a personal thing for me. Do you like that book?
In retrospect, I wish I had pushed back more on Byron. Byron was a guy who loved comics, but also hated them and held them in contempt.
Uh-huh.
And I felt that Byron was a smart guy who still had a very literal mind, and he missed metaphor. And I think the book is the best it could have been under the circumstances.
Because I love the novel. It's one of my favorites.
I do too. I mean, I regard The Demolished Man and The Stars My Destination.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of science fiction novels, it's The Demolished Man, The Stars My Destination, Behold the Man, Nova, and a couple of others.
Yeah.
Starship Troopers probably.
Oh, that's a good one.
Who are just at the apex. And for the longest time, the only edition of the book that was out there was mine.
Mm-hmm.
And the version that's out there right now is a bootleg.
Yeah.
Somebody basically scanned it and is publishing a per book.
Right.
There's a dreadful screenplay that's completely that misunderstands the narrative completely. The only way this thing can be done correct is in a miniseries streaming. The problem with doing it as a movie is that you have to end the first act with the transformation of Jeffrey Four-Mile.
Yeah.
Four-Mile has to show up at the end of the first act.
Right.
On that train.
Yeah.
Okay. And you can't, that's a lot of material to get in half an hour.
It really is. Yeah.
You know, so that is the problem. But I know exactly who should play Gully Foyle.
Yeah. Who do you think?
God, is that his name just fled me? I can't believe it. Sam Claflin.
I don't know who that is.
Sam Claflin is a very chameleon-like. He sort of fits into that Alec Baldwin, Colin Farrell thing of looking different whatever he does.
Oh yeah. Uh-huh.
Claflin played Oswald Mosley on Peaky Blinders.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I know who that is.
The lead singer in that Daisy Jones and the Six miniseries.
Yep.
Completely different.
Yeah.
And I think I like Claflin is a guy who, given the right role, is going to be a major deal.
Yeah.
Okay. But I think you're more likely to see a film version of The Demolished Man well before you see The Stars My Destination.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a little easier of a story, I think, to tell.
I read it in a single sitting.
It's so good.
It destroyed me. Well, you read the Damon Knight review?
The Damon Knight review of Demolished Man?
Of The Stars My Destination?
No, I don't know if I did.
It's worth reading. It's in a collection of criticism called Assignments in Wonder. You know Damon Knight's work.
Yeah, I know Damon. Yeah.
Knight is responsible for one of the greatest Twilight Zone episode ever. You know, he wrote To Serve Man.
To Serve Man, yeah, man.
Which kept me awake for most of 1961. And then 8 years later, I watched it when I was really high, and I realized it was one of the funniest things I'd ever seen.
Incredible.
Everybody is winking at the screen. Everybody's like playing to the audience. Get it.
It's the darkest joke that they've done on network TV at that time. It's yeah.
But again, 9 years old, I was terrified of quicksand and of space cannibals. You know, who knew? Who knew it was not going to be an issue when I got this old? At any rate, I wrote a phenomenal review of the book I think it's called Cosmic Junk.
Okay.
And I'm paraphrasing here. What he says is that in the course of the novel, Alfred Bester throws over his shoulder 100 ideas that 100 lesser novelists could make 100 lesser novels out of.
Yeah,
and that's really true.
Yeah.
I think it's an absolute tour de force. And significantly, Bester loathed comics. He came to despise them.
And he wrote, I think Green Lantern, right?
He wrote Green Lantern's Oath.
That's right. Yeah, he wrote the Oath.
I mean, think about it. You know, Gully Foyle is my name. Tara is he was a doggerel fan.
Yeah.
You know, censor says the censor, you know. And
yeah.
Is there anything before we let you go?
I'm sorry, cut out there a minute.
Yeah, he cut out a minute. Go ahead.
What?
The last thing you cut out.
I was doing my impression of Green Lantern, you know, charging.
Oh, yeah.
Is there anything you'd like to promote coming up?
Yeah, I've got, I want to sell through on all the Times Square. So those of you who are in the East Coast, buy the fucking book and two. We're going to be doing an omnibus of Black Kiss. There's an Italian, German, and Spanish edition in the omnibus. There's never been in English. I'm working on a new story that is so disgusting that will serve as the seductive back matter to those of you who've read the previous material. There's that, and Fargo will be out this fall. Fargo is the crowdfunder we did this past spring, and I'm 71 pages done of a 96-page book because unlike a lot of my colleagues, I put my money where my mouth is.
Nice. Yeah, I'm looking for that Black Kiss omnibus. I've never read the series, but I've heard of it quite a lot.
You've never seen Black Kiss?
I never read it. But I have heard a lot about it. So.
It's disgusting. It's truly disgusting. If I had any dignity law, I'd kill myself. But yeah, it's pretty fine. You'll dig it. Thanks. Gentlemen, I'm most grateful.
We'll see you at Garden State. We'll pop over.
And you go to Terrificon and go to Baltimore. You'll thank me. Trust me.
Leave the house more often.
Yeah, he doesn't leave the house either. So, thank you. Very nice talking. This was great. Take care. All right, we'll see you
guys. Thanks again. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.